President Trump says denuclearization is a major takeaway from his summit with North Korean dictator Kim Jong Un. The president said inspectors will verify North Korean compliance. He said Secretary of State Mike Pompeo will lead negotiations to determine the denuclearization process. For more, I want to bring in Face the Nation moderator and CBS News senior foreign affairs correspondent Margaret Brennan. So, Margaret, the big question everyone's asking is what happens next at this point?
Well, a lot of this is going to come down to sales and details. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo leaves Singapore, goes next to Seoul to sort of reassure our military ally there about exactly what was said in this meeting that's not in that joint statement that we have all seen. And a lot of detail is not in there, including what the plans are for these military exercises, war games as the president called them, that he says are going to be put on hold. He then goes to Beijing, and China is the sort of person or the group of individuals with the most leverage on Kim Jong Un. So they can force him to comply with what he's agreeing to. So Secretary of State, after he makes those visits, then has to actually iron out some of these differences. John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, and he are going to meet with North Koreans next week. So there's a lot of detail still and a lot of work to be done that we just don't know about yet.
Well, of course, the president dropped out of the nuclear agreement with Iran because he said it wasn't strong enough. So what is different this time?
Well, it took 2 years to get the agreement with Iran, of intense negotiations over every little detail. That hasn't been where we are right now. These have been very basic conversations. This is a framework agreement we saw today. If you want to call it an agreement at all, it's more sort of a statement of principles. And so that kind of negotiation still has to happen, but it has been blessed from above in some ways, right? Kim Jong Un is the voice that matters when he says he wants to go ahead with this. So now delivering the details is what is up to the diplomats to do. This can be drawn out. The president gave himself a lot of wiggle room. He said, I could stand up here in 6 months and tell you I was wrong. So he's given himself room to back out. And Kim Jong Un, of course, also has that ability.
So that's been fascinating to watch, sort of the hedging. But is there any reason this time to think that North Korea will actually stick to an agreement?
These are two very different leaders, and the chemistry that they talk about, maybe it's different based on the decision maker. Is Kim Jong Un, because of his age, that he's 33, 34, or so, because he has been educated in the West? Remember, he went to boarding school in Switzerland, because he has this voracious appetite for all things American culture. Is there something different about him? Does he want to define his country differently? That doesn't necessarily mean he wants the Jeffersonian democracy, but maybe he is hungering for a country without the kind of strangulation that they have seen through sanctions. And that is the bet that the White House is making here, that they can incentivize him and try to convince him that he doesn't need those nuclear weapons to stay in power.
So President Trump, of course, sat down for interviews with several media outlets, including the Voice of America's Greta Van Susteren, talking about Kim Jong Un. Let's listen to some of that.
What surprised you today about Kim Jong Un?
Really, he's got a great personality. He's a, funny guy. He's a very smart guy. He's a great negotiator. He loves his people. Not that I'm surprised by that, but he loves his people.
All right, interesting, Margaret, to hear the president's praise there. At the same time, really not much of a focus on human rights. So talk to me a little bit about the possibility of that being discussed at some point.
Well, look, it's tough with President Trump not to, remark on how unusual this is to flatter a massive human rights abuser and dictator, right? I mean, that is what Kim Jong Un is. This is not the first time an American president has cut a deal with someone who's got a pretty bad human rights record. But for him to say he's a great guy with a great personality, that's certainly not how he is defined to most people. The gulags, the labor camps, the starvation is what people remember when it comes to his people, not loving them. But on the question of human rights, this is the trade-off. This is the same bet that President Obama made with Iran. On a narrow issue that is of direct national security interest to the United States, can we just handle this one equation? Of course, President Obama was deeply criticized for only focusing on that narrow sliver. And so, yes, it is fair to ask those same questions of President Trump. If you just focus on this narrow sliver, is there something you're sacrificing in terms of American values here? And the gamble with both, it seems, is over the long term, maybe by having this change, other parts of their culture or their behavior or their political regime might too.
Back on that question of what the president called war games. So the president said he would stop joint military exercises or war games with South Korea, suggested he would like to withdraw troops at some time, but did not go into any detail on that, Margaret. And I wonder what would that mean for U.S. standing in the region if, in fact, he were to follow through with that? Because, as others have pointed out, it's not just about the Korean Peninsula itself. It's about the American presence in the broader region.
And this was the most worrisome phrase to many of the Republican allies of the president who are more hawkish in their positioning and their views of U.S. national security. They don't want to see the U.S. take back its presence because they're concerned about China's dominance in the region, et cetera. So that is why there are so many questions being asked about this. It also caught a lot of high-ranking military officials very much by surprise. They just couldn't answer questions today. So the strategy, the lack of communication within the administration was poor on this, but it's not unusual to have such a tightly held negotiation stay in that tight circle. Defense Secretary Mattis claims that he was in the loop. So while his lower-ranking officials were caught by surprise, made that clear today, he says he knew. And that this, for now, is not withdrawing troops. It's just talking about the possibility in the future.
Fascinating times we're living in. Margaret Brennan, thank you so much for stopping by.